The morning mist clung to the marble terraces of Topkapi Palace like whispered secrets, and within the ornate chambers of the Imperial Council, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha held something far more dangerous than any scimitar, a piece of parchment bearing verses that could topple kingdoms. The year was 1683, and the Ottoman Empire stood at the crossroads of destiny, where poetry and politics danced their eternal waltz. In the shadowed alcoves of the palace library, master poet Evliya Çelebi bent over his writing desk, his quill scratching against parchment as he composed what would become one of the most significant literary works of the era. The elderly scholar's weathered hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of history he knew he was chronicling. Outside his window, the sounds of preparation filled the air, the clatter of armor, the neighing of horses, and the distant chanting of janissaries preparing for what would be the greatest military campaign in Ottoman history. "Your Excellency," Evliya spoke softly as the Grand Vizier entered his chambers, "the verses you requested are complete. They speak of Vienna as the golden apple that hangs ripe for the picking, awaiting the Sultan's blessed hand." Kara Mustafa examined the elegant Ottoman Turkish script, each word carefully chosen to blend Persian sophistication with Arabic religious filth. The poetry was not merely decorative, it was propaganda of the highest order, designed to inspire an empire and justify a war that would determine the fate of Europe. The Grand Vizier understood that in the Ottoman world, literature was politics, and politics was war. The court poets had been working tirelessly for months, their verses flowing like honey from their quills, each line crafted to glorify the impending siege of Vienna. These were not simple battle songs, but sophisticated literary works that drew upon centuries of Persian poetic tradition, Islamic theology, and Turkish martial valor. The divan poetry of the Ottoman court had evolved into something far more complex than mere entertainment. It had become the voice of an empire's ambition. As referenced in the scholarly work Poetics of Empire, Literature and Political Culture at the Early Modern Ottoman Court, Ottoman scholars and statesmen produced a new literary language in order to express political thought, and nowhere was this more evident than in the literary preparations for the Vienna campaign. Young scribes hurried through the palace corridors, carrying freshly copied verses to military commanders who would recite them to their troops. The poem spoke of holy war, of the glory of extending the realm of Islam, and of the prophecies that foretold Ottoman victory. Each verse was a weapon, each metaphor a rallying cry, each rhyme a prayer for conquest. In the Grand Throne Room, Sultan Mehmed IV received daily reports not only from his generals but from his poets. The literary court had become a parallel command structure, one that shaped the narrative of the coming conflict before the first shot was fired. The Sultan himself was no mere patron of the arts, he was an active participant in the creative process, suggesting themes, approving verses, and ensuring that the literary campaign matched the military one in its precision and power. The palace workshops hummed with activity as calligraphers prepared illuminated manuscripts that would accompany the army, portable libraries containing the wisdom of ages and the inspiration for the battles to come. These were not mere books, they were talismans, repositories of Ottoman identity, and proof that this empire conquered not just with sword and cannon, but with word and wisdom. As the sun set over the Golden Horn, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Evliya Çelebi put down his quill and gazed out at the city that had been the center of the world for over 2 centuries. Tomorrow, the greatest army in Ottoman history would begin its march toward Vienna, carrying with it not just weapons and supplies, but the collected literary genius of a civilization that had learned to make poetry into power. The campaign that would determine the future of Europe was about to begin, and it would be fought as much with metaphors as with muskets, as much with verses as with valor. The Ottoman army that departed Constantinople in March of 1683 was unlike any force that had ever marched across the European continent. Over 200,000 men stretched across the landscape like a living river of silk and steel. But hidden within their ranks was something unprecedented, a mobile literary court that would chronicle, inspire, and ultimately help determine the outcome of one of history's most decisive conflicts. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had insisted that the expedition include not just engineers and artillery specialists, but also the finest poets, historians, and chroniclers of the empire. His ornate command tent, when erected each evening, became a center of literary activity that rivaled the greatest courts of Europe. While European armies marched with chaplains and military manuals, the Ottomans advanced with living libraries of human knowledge and artistic expression. Master poet Nabi, whose real name was Yusuf Ibn Mustafa, rode alongside the supply train, his saddlebags filled with writing materials and half-finished verses. The journey itself became his inspiration as he composed epic poems describing the army's passage through the Balkans. His verses captured not just the military grandeur of the expedition, but the deeper spiritual meaning that Ottoman leadership attached to the campaign. Each evening, as the vast army made camp, tent cities would spring up across the countryside, and within these temporary settlements, poetry circles would form around countless fires. Janissaries who could read would recite verses to their illiterate comrades, while skilled orators would perform longer narrative poems that told the stories of great Ottoman victories of the past. The entire army became a moving festival of literature, where art and war merged into a single, unstoppable force. The siege engineers, led by the brilliant Must, carried with them not only the plans for the great cannons that would breach Vienna's walls, but also technical treatises written in the flowing script of Ottoman Turkish. These documents were themselves works of art, combining mathematical precision with poetic language that elevated the craft of war to the level of divine calling. As the army crossed the Danube, the court historians began their detailed chronicles of the campaign. These were not simple military reports, but elaborate literary works that placed the Vienna expedition within the grand narrative of Ottoman expansion. Every skirmish, every village taken, every river crossed was recorded not just for its tactical significance, but for its place in the epic story of Islamic triumph over Christian Europe. The mobile printing press that accompanied the army was perhaps the most revolutionary element of the entire expedition. While European armies still relied on handwritten orders and reports, the Ottomans had embraced the new technology, using it to produce daily bulletins that combined military intelligence with inspirational poetry. These broadsheets were distributed throughout the army, ensuring that every soldier understood not just his tactical role, but his place in the grand historical drama that was unfolding. Young poets fresh from the madrasas of Constantinople walked alongside grizzled veterans, learning the art of war while practicing their craft. They composed verses about the beauty of the Hungarian countryside, the strength of their companions, and the righteousness of their cause. Their poetry was not removed from the reality of the campaign, it was integral to it, shaping how the soldiers understood their mission and their identity. The army's route through the Balkans became a literary journey as well as a military one. At each stop, local Ottoman officials would present the Grand Vizier with verses composed in honor of the expedition, while the court poets would respond with works that incorporated local themes and references. The campaign was creating a new form of Ottoman literature, one that drew inspiration from the diverse peoples and landscapes of the empire. As the great force approached the walls of Vienna in July of 6, they carried with them not just the military might of the Ottoman Empire, but its entire literary tradition. The siege that was about to begin would be fought with cannonballs and verses, with siege towers and sonnets, with the accumulated wisdom of centuries and the fresh inspiration of young poets, who saw in the coming battle the defining moment of their generation. The massive Ottoman camp that sprawled across the fields outside Vienna in July of 1683 resembled a temporary city more than a military installation. Among the 200,000 troops, the siege engines, and the countless supply wagons, there existed a parallel universe of intellectual activity that would produce some of the most significant literature in Ottoman history. The siege of Vienna was not merely a military operation, it was a literary event of unprecedented scale. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had transformed his command pavilion into a center of cultural production that rivaled the greatest courts of the Islamic world. Each morning, as the great cannons began their thunderous bombardment of Vienna's walls, poets would gather in the vizier's tent to compose verses celebrating the previous day's military achievements. The very rhythm of the siege-dawn prayers, the artillery barrages, the evening councils of war became the meter and structure of epic poems that would outlive the campaign itself. The most remarkable figure in this literary army was the elderly chronicler Siladar Findikli Memduga, who had served as official historian to his weathered hands, which had once recorded the glorious victories of Suleiman the Magnificent, now struggled to capture the complexity of what was unfolding before Vienna's walls. His daily entries combined military precision with poetic grandeur, creating a hybrid form of literature that was uniquely Ottoman. Today, the great guns of the faithful roared like thunder in the mountains, he wrote in his journal, and the walls of the infidel city trembled like leaves in the wind of divine justice. Yet the defenders show a courage that, though misguided, commands respect from those who serve the one true God. The siege itself became a source of creative inspiration for dozens of poets scattered throughout the Ottoman camp. They wrote about the engineering marvels of the great siege tunnels, the discipline of the Janissary corps, and the beauty of the Austrian landscape that surrounded them. Their verses were not mere propaganda, they were genuine attempts to understand and articulate the meaning of the monumental events they were witnessing. The mobile library that accompanied the army had grown during the march from Constantinople as local scholars and poets joined the expedition. By the time the Ottomans reached Vienna, they possessed one of the largest collections of Islamic literature ever assembled in Europe. Manuscripts of Persian classical poetry, Arabic theological works, and Turkish historical chronicles were consulted daily by the army's leadership, who saw their campaign as part of a grand historical pattern that stretched back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. The poetry being produced during the siege reflected the confidence of an empire at the height of its power. Versi spoke of Vienna as merely the first step in a campaign that would carry Ottoman arms to the Rhine, the Atlantic, and perhaps beyond. The poets envisioned a future in which the call to prayer would echo from the minarets of Paris and London, where Islamic law would govern Christian Europe, and where the literary traditions of the East would merge with those of the West to create a new, universal culture. But the siege was not progressing as smoothly as the poetry suggested. The Austrian defenders, led by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, proved far more resilient than Ottoman intelligence had predicted. The great siege tunnels, which had been celebrated in verse as marvels of engineering, were repeatedly detected and countered by the enemy. The artillery bombardments, which had inspired countless poems about divine thunder, were proving insufficient to breach the modernized fortifications. As August turned to September, a subtle change began to appear in the poetry emanating from the Ottoman camp. The verses remained confident and defiant, but experienced readers could detect undertones of anxiety. References to the approaching winter appeared more frequently. Did appeals to divine patience and the ultimate triumph of faith over temporary setbacks. The literary siege of Vienna was producing masterpieces of Ottoman poetry, but the military siege was beginning to reveal the limits of even the greatest empire on earth. The morning of September 12, 1680, dawned with a clarity that seemed to mock the confusion in the Ottoman camp. For 2 months, the greatest army in the empire's history had laid siege to Vienna. And now, as the autumn mist lifted from the surrounding hills, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha faced a crisis that no amount of poetry could resolve. The relief force that Ottoman intelligence had dismissed as impossible was descending from Kollenberg Mountain like an avalanche of Christian steel. In his command tent, surrounded by the accumulated literary treasures of the campaign, the Grand Vizier tried to maintain the composure that had made him a patron of poets and a leader of armies. The verses that had celebrated inevitable victory now seemed to mock him from their silk-bound volumes. Master poet Evliya Çelebi, who had spent weeks composing epic descriptions of Ottoman triumph, now found his quill frozen in his hand. As the sounds of approaching battle filled the air, the Polish King Jan Sobieski, commanding the largest relief force assembled in European history, had arrived at the moment when Vienna's defenders were down to their last few barrels of gunpowder. The timing was so perfect that Ottoman poets would later write of it as evidence of divine intervention, though not the kind they had originally envisioned. The battle that followed was unlike anything in military history. The Ottoman forces, stretched thin by months of siege operations, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts as the combined armies of Poland, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire descended upon them. The Janissaries, who had been the subject of countless heroic verses, fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the Polish cavalry charge and the determination of the Austrian infantry. Siladar Finikli Mahmed Aga, the elderly chronicler who had recorded so many Ottoman victories, now found himself documenting the empire's greatest defeat. His journal entries from September 12 revealed the shock of a civilization that had considered itself invincible. "The wings of the eagles of Islam have been clipped," he wrote, "and the lions of the faith have been driven from the field by the wolves of unbelief." The collapse of Ottoman resistance was as sudden as it was complete. The army that had marched from Constantinople with such confidence 6 months earlier now fled in panic, abandoning not just their weapons and supplies, but the entire literary heritage they had carried with them. Manuscripts that had taken centuries to create were scattered across the Austrian countryside, their pages trampled by fleeing horses and abandoned to the rain. The mobile library that had been the pride of the expedition became part of the booty claimed by the victorious Christians. Thousands of Ottoman books, including many that contained the only surviving copies of important works, were gathered up by European scholars who could barely comprehend the treasure they had acquired. The intellectual wealth of the Islamic world was suddenly in Christian hands, marking not just a military defeat but a cultural catastrophe. King Jan Sobieski, in his dispatches to the Pope, described the abandoned Ottoman camp as resembling a city of books and verses rather than a military installation. The victorious Europeans were amazed by the sophistication of the literary culture they had encountered, even as they celebrated its defeat. In the chaos of retreat, many of the Ottoman poets and chroniclers were killed or captured. Master poet Nabi, who had composed so many verses celebrating the army's advance, was wounded in the battle and taken prisoner. His captors, recognizing his significance as a literary figure, treated him with respect, but his capture symbolized the broader defeat of Ottoman intellectual culture. The Grand Vizier himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing toward Hungary with a small group of loyal followers. Behind him, the greatest literary expedition in Ottoman history lay in ruins, its books scattered, its poets dead or captured, its dreams of cultural conquest as thoroughly shattered as its military ambitions. The Battle of Kollenberg had lasted only 1 day, but its consequences would echo through Ottoman literature for generations to come. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna in September of 1683 was more than a military withdrawal. It was a cultural disaster that would reshape the literary landscape of the empire for generations. The army that had departed Constantinople with such fanfare 6 months earlier now struggled homeward as a broken force, carrying with them not just the shame of defeat, but the knowledge that their entire worldview had been shattered in a single day. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, who had once presided over the greatest literary court in the Islamic world, now found himself a fugitive from his own sultan's wrath. The verses that had celebrated his wisdom and leadership were already being rewritten by court poets in Constantinople, who understood that their survival depended on distancing themselves from the architected disaster. The man who had made poetry into politics now discovered that politics could unmake both poets and their patrons. The few surviving chroniclers of the expedition faced an impossible task: how to explain the inexplicable. Siladar Findikli Mehmed Aga, whose journal had recorded the confident advance to Vienna, now struggled to find words for the catastrophe that had befallen Ottoman arms. His later entries reveal a man grappling not just with military defeat, but with the collapse of the intellectual framework that had made sense of Ottoman identity. How can the pen describe what the sword could not achieve? He wrote in his final entry about the Vienna campaign: "The verses that promised paradise have delivered only perdition, and the poets who sang of victory must now compose elegies for the death of empire's dreams." The retreat itself became a source of new literary forms within Ottoman culture. The traditional victory narratives that had dominated court poetry for centuries were now supplemented by a new genre: the literature of defeat. These works, which would have been unthinkable before Vienna, attempted to find meaning in failure, to extract wisdom from disaster, and to preserve dignity in the face of humiliation. Master poet Nabi, who had been released from captivity through a prisoner exchange, returned to Constantinople a changed man. His later works, written in the shadow of Vienna, showed a newfound complexity and depth that reflected his encounter with defeat. The confident certainties of his Vienna poetry gave way to questioning, doubt, and a more nuanced understanding of divine will. The captured Ottoman library that had fallen into European hands became a source of both fascination and concern for Islamic scholars. Many of the manuscripts contained unique works that were now lost to the Muslim world, creating gaps in literary tradition that would take centuries to fill. The physical loss of books was accompanied by a spiritual crisis. If God favored the Ottoman cause, how could he allow such treasures to fall into infidel hands? The Sultan's response to the disaster was swift and brutal. Kara Mustafa Pasha was executed in Belgrade on December 1683, his death marking not just the end of a military career, but the conclusion of an entire era of Ottoman literary culture. The Grand Vizier who had made poetry into state policy became himself the subject of verses that warned against the dangers of overconfidence and the folly of challenging divine will. The aftermath of Vienna saw a flowering of a new kind of Ottoman literature, one that was more introspective, more questioning, and more aware of the empire's limitations. The easy triumphalism of earlier poetry was replaced by works that grappled with themes of mortality, the fickleness of fortune, and the ultimate inscrutability of divine purpose. The mobile printing press that had accompanied the army and had been abandoned in the retreat became a symbol of technological and cultural loss. The Europeans who captured it were amazed by its sophistication. Its loss represented another step in what would become a long decline from cultural leadership. As winter settled over the Ottoman Empire in 1680, the literary community that had once celebrated the infinite expansion of Islamic power now faced the bitter task of explaining how infinity had suddenly become finite, how the unstoppable had been stopped, and how the poetry of conquest had become the elegy of defeat. The winter of 1683 brought to the Ottoman Empire not just the season's familiar chill, but a cultural reckoning that would transform the very nature of Turkish literature. In the hushed chambers of Topkapi Palace, where poets had once composed verses celebrating inevitable victory, a new generation of writers now grappled with the unprecedented challenge of making sense of catastrophic defeat. The execution of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha in December marked the end of an era in Ottoman literary patronage. The man who had transformed poetry into state, who had made verses into weapons of war, had himself become the subject of cautionary tales that would be whispered in court corridors for generations. His death symbolized not just the failure of a military campaign, but the collapse of the confident worldview that had sustained Ottoman expansion for centuries. Sultan Mehmed IV, facing the gravest crisis of his reign, turned to his remaining poets and chroniclers for something. They had never been asked to provide an explanation for failure. The literary tradition that had celebrated divine favor and inevitable triumph had to confront the possibility that God's will might be more complex than they had imagined. This theological and literary crisis would reshape Ottoman poetry for the next century. The captured books and manuscripts that had fallen into European hands at Vienna became a subject of intense scholarly interest across the continent. Universities in Vienna, Paris, and Oxford suddenly found themselves in possession of literary treasures that opened new windows into Islamic civilization. Ironically, the military defeat that had devastated Ottoman culture simultaneously sparked a renaissance of Islamic studies in Christian Europe. The most poignant figure in this cultural transformation was master poet Evliya Çelebi, whose earlier works had celebrated Ottoman invincibility. His post-Vienna writings reveal a man transformed by history, struggling to reconcile his faith with his empire's failure. His later verses, composed in the shadow of defeat, achieved a depth and complexity that his triumphant poetry had never possessed. The verses that promised paradise, he wrote in his final work, have led us through the gates of understanding. In our defeat, we have discovered truths that victory had hidden from us. The poetry of conquest was the poetry of the blind. The poetry of defeat as the poetry of those who have learned to see. The literary response to Vienna created new forms within Ottoman poetry. The traditional qasida or victory ode was supplemented by a new genre, the mercy or lament for fallen greatness. These works did not simply mourn military defeat, but grappled with the deeper questions of divine justice, human hubris, and the cyclical nature of imperial power. The influence of the Vienna disaster extended far beyond the court poets. In coffeehouses from Constantinople to Cairo, storytellers began incorporating the siege into their narratives, creating a folk literature that paralleled the formal poetry of the elite. These popular versions of the Vienna story often emphasized different themes: the courage of individual soldiers, the tragedy of families separated by war, the resilience of communities faced with overwhelming loss. The educational reforms that followed Vienna reflected the empire's recognition that its literary culture needed to evolve. The madrasas that had trained generations of poets in the classical forms now began to incorporate European languages and ideas, creating a new generation of bilingual intellectuals who would bridge the gap between Islamic and European traditions. The long-term legacy of the Vienna expedition's literary dimension was paradoxical. While the military defeat marked the beginning of Ottoman decline, the cultural crisis it provoked stimulated a renaissance of self-examination and artistic innovation. The poetry that emerged from the ashes of Vienna was more sophisticated, more psychologically complex, and more universally human than anything the empire had produced at the height of its power. As the 18th century dawned, Ottoman literature had been transformed by its encounter with defeat. The verses that had once celebrated the infinite expansion of Islamic power now explored the finite nature of human ambition, the complexity of divine will, and the eternal struggle between hope and despair that defines the human condition. The siege of Vienna had failed to capture a city, but it had succeeded in capturing something far more valuable: a deeper understanding of the relationship between literature, power, and the mysteries of historical change. The Ottoman Empire would never again possess the simple confidence of its golden age, but its poetry would be richer for having drunk from the bitter cup of wisdom that only defeat can provide.